We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm the president and founder of the California Rock Art Foundation. And what we do is we identify, evaluate, manage, and conserve rock art both in Alta California and in Baja California. We conduct field trips, we have trainings, exercise, we do research, and in every way possible, we try to preserve, protect, and coordinate treasures of Alta and Baja California rock art, of which there are many and diverse. We also work closely with Native Americans and partner with them to recognize and protect sacred sites. So for more info about the fabulous California Rock Art Foundation, you can go to carockart.org. Also, I'm open to give me a call, 805-312-2261. We would welcome sponsorship or underwriting, helping us to defray the costs of our podcasts, and also membership in California Rock Art Foundation. And of course, donations, since we are a 501c3 nonprofit scientific and educational corporation. God bless everyone out there in podcast land.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions.
Welcome to the Rock Art Podcast. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. This is episode 26 of the Rock Art Podcast, and we're blessed and honored to have the principal archaeologist for the National Mojave Preserve, which is in the eastern Mojave Desert. His name is David Nichols, and he will be speaking about rock art, his own background, and a unique perspective on rock art. Welcome out there to my audience of people who have tuned in the past and are tuning in now for the Rock Art Podcast on the Archaeology Podcast Network. And we have a wonderful guest today. He is the archaeologist, the principal archaeologist for the entire National Mojave Preserve, and that is in the eastern Mojave Desert. And it's jam-chucky full of remarkable rock art sites. And he has the responsibility of doing something to manage those sites. And I think we'll hear from David Nichols a bit about his background and how he can possibly go about that. David, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Tell us where you're geographically right now.
So geographically, I am on my own private 30-acre in-holding parcel in the middle of the Mojave National Preserve. I'm the only National Park Service employee at this particular Park Service unit that is also a private landholder. And what's one of the unique and wonderful things about this particular park is you can own private property here, and the government won't take it away from you, although you are encouraged to sell your property eventually to the National Park Service. And I am here at 5,200 feet with my wood-burning stove blazing away.
That's rather wonderful. So if we look and reflect and take kind of a backwards glance towards your life, the opening question is often one that I call it the million-dollar question. How the heck did you get to where you are now, and how did you get interested in this subject matter of archaeology, anthropology, rock art, and things related to Native American or indigenous people worldwide? How did you ever find yourself interested in specializing in that domain? Where did it all begin?
Well, for starters, I am a tribal citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. So I grew up with stories from my grandparents and my parents about the Trail of Tears and the history of the Muskogee Nation from the Georgia and northern Florida, Arkansas areas. And I always had an interest in archaeology and Native American history as pertains to especially North America. And flash forward in 1989, I graduated from University of California at Santa Barbara At that time, not having any idea that there was actually a degree offered in anthropology, much less archaeology. So I ended up with a degree in mathematics. But I took that degree.
Really?
I took that degree. And it's a BA in mathematics. So it's more theoretical rather than applied side. And I got a job with a small archaeological firm in Hawaii.
Oh, my word.
And what I did was I hired on as a computer consultant, and I turned, and this is 1989 again, remember, I turned all of his entire business from hard copy sort of paper business into all computer-based, including illustrations and cartography and everything else. And he was such a small company that he eventually started training me and utilizing me in field work, excavation, survey, and whatnot. A couple of years with him, and I hired on with a larger environmental firm, and then spent the next 15 years working across the Pacific from Hawaii to Australia, doing archaeological work. Later on, I relocated back to California.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So half my career was actually in the Pacific. And you could divide half of that in again itself between World War II archaeology and prehistoric archaeology of several different Micronesian and Polynesian cultures. Got tired of the island life, relocated back to California, which is where I'm from, Los Angeles area. And at age 35, applied to grad school at Sonoma State University and finally got that degree in anthropology. The interesting part of that was they looked back, and not having an undergraduate degree in anthropology sort of posed a academic issue for them. They were going to have me do some remedial undergraduate courses. But after my first year in graduate school, with all the years of field work and personal study I had done with theory and methods, decided I didn't have to take any of those undergraduate courses, which was a fortunate thing.
What did you find was the most kind of valuable or interesting or engaging part of your 15-year stint all across various places doing cultural studies? That must have been fascinating.
Well, each island group, and I worked in several different ones. I worked in the Marianas Islands, Guam, the Marshall Islands, and the Hawaiian Islands. They all have a very different, very unique type of archaeology, which is fascinating in and amongst each island group. In Hawaii, you could be miles, and this actually happened to me, miles away from the ocean. You step into a volcanic lava tube and you find a canoe burial in there where you find a skeleton wrapped in decorated bark cloth with woven baskets next to the craniums. And that's very different from, say, something on the island of Tinian in the Northern Marianas Islands, where you excavate through 30 centimeters of cultural deposit and find a caliche or calcium carbonate hard pan floor and randomly break through it with an iron bar and find the oldest deposit ever found in the Marianas Islands below that. And that also happened to me as well. It's real different from culture to culture, but the stuff out there is fascinating. Thing is, you have to have a mindset to be able to want to live on islands, which I got burned out on pretty much after that 15 years.
So you had 15 years of field work, then you decided to come back to California.
Right.
And you enrolled at Sonoma State to get your master's degree.
Right.
What was that like? Was that a productive time? Did you do a thesis?
Yeah, I did a thesis that I had to defend. My heart was always in this part of California where I work now, though, the Mojave Desert. I had grown up coming out here with my father, camping and hunting and four-wheeling in this area and finding petroglyphs, a site that you're working on, Mary's Cave. I grew up hunting around that area, so I've known about that site since I was a kid because my dad always pointed it out to me. So when I came back to California, you don't have bifaces in the Pacific. So I didn't even know what a biface was. So I did not feel qualified to apply to a graduate program in California to do archaeology in the area that I loved, knowing that I didn't have the knowledge base. So I did spend 5 years working in California before I applied to that graduate program. And then when I was accepted into that graduate program at Sonoma State, I did all of my studies in the California desert where I'm at now.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And what I like to tell aspiring graduate students in archaeology is, hey, do your research while you're in graduate school, while you're able to, in the area that you want to end up in. As it turned out, what happened for me was National Park Service personnel started noticing me sort of haunting around sites that I was aware of in the desert area down here. And they ended up hiring me as the local expert. This place where I work now was called the Lonesome Triangle. And it was called that in archaeological circles professionally because so little research had been done here. To date, I've done as much or more research as anybody over the majority of this 1.6 million acre area.
Wonderful. What an interesting segue. So you find yourself there in this Lonesome Triangle. How did you come? What transformed over the time you've been there? I imagine there's been some rather interesting developments in terms of your program and what you were doing. Were you hired on as the resident expert from the get-go?
So they had no field archaeologists. They've always had people, this became a park in 1994 under President Clinton. They've always had sort of an overriding managerial personage in the capacity or title of park archaeologists here. They never had a field person. Mm-hmm. And typically these people that had held that position were, stodgy old folks that had worked all across the U.S. at various other parks. So I was the first actual youngish sort of person that they hired on as the park archaeologist, quote unquote. And I was expected to run around like a madman and do all kinds of field work, create my own projects, run my own program, which I largely did for up until 5 years ago. Lots and lots of field work.
Okay. And what happened?
Well, you get different people in charge of parks, and a fellow came along and decided that I should be more of a manager and be managing the program and spending much less time in the field. Where is how folks like yourself have come along. So whereas you're doing now the type of research out here that I personally used to do, now, I'm more about getting funding and putting together contracts and finding interested personnel to do the work and sort of riding herd on those contracts.
Well, let's jump back. You said that when you were at Sonoma State, you did a thesis and that you spent a lot of time doing research in the Mojave Desert. Can you give us a few glimmers of what that was all about?
Sure. So Sonoma State's in the Bay Area, and of course, we're about 400 miles south of Sonoma State here in the desert, but I had from day one absolutely planned on and dedicated myself towards doing my research here in what is Mojave National Preserve. So what I ended up doing was finding an old miner's cabin and moving into it, lock, stock, and barrel. I lived in this little miner's cabin for 8.5 months. And in that cabin, I did all of my field work and all of the thesis write-up under lantern light. I would do field work during the day and then write up and formalize notes in the evening under lamp light. And, we're talking over 100 degrees in the summer, no cooling, and then 6-degree winters in the snow in that same little cabin. What I did was I looked at 12 perennial springs in the preserve. This is a particularly wet part of the Mojave Desert. It's rather surprising. But when you see these things, you realize that there is actually quite a bit of water here. And what I wanted to look at was surveying areas geographically defined, what we call intuitive surveys, right? You come across some kind of a geographic barrier, like a sharp ridge or something. And then if you cross that, you've left the area of interest, which for my study would have been the water source. And what I wanted to look at was all of the prehistoric archaeological sites around those water sources and whether or not they were there because of the water access. Were these sites dependent on the water being there or weren't they? And of course, the conclusion to that was both. There were some sites there that absolutely were dependent on water being available, and there were some sites that were absolutely independent of water being there or not. And I did try to write a proposal as a follow-up because that was my thesis work. But within the park, I told them, hey, that's only half the study. Now, what we should be looking at are similar geographic areas that don't have a water source and seeing if, what that site distribution looks like.
Fascinating. Well, it sounds like we've gotten to an interesting juncture in our conversation. We kind of are moving along, talking about your thesis. And I guess the next thing is going to be to talk about what it's like to be a park archaeologist in the National Mojave Preserve on the 1.6 million acres, and what sort of resources are there, and what kind of rock art is interesting and dynamic and endlessly engaging. So I'll catch you on the flip-flop.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ROCKART. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Welcome back to the Rock Art Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, and I'm proud and blessed to have David Nichols, who is the park archaeologist for the National Mojave Preserve. And I apologize, we haven't spoken extensively about that and by way of description. David, before we jump into some of the strategy and some of the particular challenges that you face in trying to manage almost 2 million acres, tell us a bit about what makes the National Mojave Preserve distinctive. Where is it? What is it? And how is it configured in what kind of elevation, floristic zone, and, the run of the land? How's that? The busman's holiday.
That all sounds good. Well, Mojave National Preserve it's a National Park Service unit. It's called a preserve because we allow mining and ranching and hunting, but it's part of the National Park Service, and it's treated just like most other national parks. We have all the emblems and the rangers with the flat hats and everything else. This is the third largest national park unit in the continental U.S., third largest after Yellowstone and Death Valley. So it's huge. Again, 1.6 million acres. We have elevations ranging from 800 feet to 8,000 feet, which include Pleistocene dry lakes all the way up to relict white fir forests up in our highest points. So In terms of an archaeological context, you can imagine, especially for a desert environment, that we have just about every kind of resource imaginable. We actually have some unique geographic areas that are Pleistocene relics, that are canyons that are situated in such a way that they have retained sort of a coastal scrub type community. So we have things like manzanita and madrone, and really lots of oaks. We have live oak and scrub oak, and it's interesting. I mean, if you can think about, most people don't think about gathering acorns or pine nuts in the desert, but we absolutely have those resources here.
Amazing. So I guess the major plant forms you have is Joshua tree, pinyon pine, and then other sorts of, almost coniferous forest at parts, don't you?
We do in the highest points. And then, we have the low desert scrub that you get down around the Pleistocene, the lake shores. Those lake shores are fascinating too, because we're actually working, I'll talk about that in the third segment, but there's some fascinating and unique archaeology to be seen around those lake shores as well.
Fantastic. So since this is a rock art show, and one of the reasons I have you on here is because of rock art, can you give us a thumbnail sketch of what kinds of rock art resources there exist in this 1.6 million acre preserve?
So we have petroglyphs and pictographs. I have yet to find any geoglyphs here, although I know that they're on either side of the preserve itself. So there's no reason to not think that they might be somewhere in the preserve as well. But, at 1.6 million acres, I'd say less than 1% has been systematically surveyed and inventoried. So many generations of archaeologists will have plenty of work to do here. Culturally, what we're looking at are the archaic. Those would be the types of Great Basin, curvilinear, abstract type stuff that can't be culturally typed. That's sort of the catch-all ancient types of petroglyphs that we find. Coming into 700 to 1700, you've got Patayan style, which would be the ancestral Mojave. The Mojave specific to this area. This is kind of the heartland of the Mojave prior to 1700. And theirs is what we call the Grapevine Canyon style. It's a very distinctive style. It's geometric. It tends to be symmetrical. The glyphs tend to be complete in and of themselves. You can find them in combinations, or you can find them by themselves, a unique glyph. To our Eurocentric eye, they're rather pleasing looking, unlike the archaic stuff, which just sort of meanders and has, lines that wander off with dots and scarring on the rock surface. And then the most recent style we have is what they call the pneumic scratching, which we ascribe to the Chemehuevi, which are a Southern Paiute group that moved into the area through the pneumic expansion in the 1700s. And in this area, those were the peoples that the U.S. Army and miners and homesteaders and travelers, immigrants were running into in this area. The pneumic scratching tends to be single, fine line incised. It tends to look like cross-hatching or chevrons. A lot of times you'll find it superimposed over the top of the Mojave Patayan style. The Mojave Patayan style tends to be much larger glyphs than the pneumic scratching, and it comes in a variety of methods, of typologies, including pecked, grooved, and abraded. And the archaic style tends to be pecked and abraded. So and we also have pictographs. Pictographs are harder to type. We generally think that the Numa were making the pictographs out here, as well as the Mojave. We're not completely sure. We haven't really done any kind of dating out here for pictographs, and stylistically, they're kind of all over the place. We haven't been able to pin them down or attribute them to any particular group, with the exception of when we find horse and rider images, in which case we are able to ascribe those to the Numa.
Interesting.
Also, with the petroglyph style, I think you can include cupules. We don't have a lot of cupule sites out here, but when we do, they're usually at pretty special, intense use areas.
Interesting. What has been the general thought of the purpose or the sort of the function and nature of these rock art expressions? What have the scholars, the archaeologists, the anthropologists helped us understand as the nature of how those particular expressions, those sites, fit into the cultural systems as part of their ongoing lifeways?
Boy, you're asking the wrong guy that question. So I learned I learned early on that archaeologists that work in the rock art, in theory of rock art, and what it means, and scholastic theory.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to find two PhDs that have the same thought on it. I actually did a paper in graduate school about whether or not rock art could be considered doodling. I mean, they had the same brains that we have now. They have the same thought processes. They had the same interests. They probably did artwork. They probably had some leisure time. Sure. Why couldn't they be doodles? And when I threw that out there, boy, I got hammered by the rock art community. They didn't want to hear anything about prehistoric doodling. So, I leave it to folks like yourself and Dr. Whitley. And what I like to do is read the different literature and what the latest theories are on the rock art. But I don't speak to it myself, because I don't study it the same way you manic rock art folk do. But I am interested in it, and I do keep up with it. But the general feeling is that it's ceremonial, and I can see in terms of larger site context why that would be considered as it is. Out here specifically, you tend to find rock art a lot of times around significant water sources. You could argue that the fact that you're in this vast desert and there's water there, that you might take some time and peck some images on the stones around you, because you don't have to hurry up. You've got water right there. And a lot of times out here, you'll find bedrock milling associated with these, especially petroglyph sites around water sources too. So, arguably you're sustaining yourself while you're sitting there with an abundance of water and scribing these images to the stone faces.
Well, let's talk about a different aspect of rock art. Why are people so interested in rock art? The general public, Native Americans. There seems to be a growing passion, certainly, to visit and perhaps appreciate rock art sites. Do you see that in the park?
Yeah, for sure. And I understand that.
Aware of? Okay.
Yeah, for sure. It's fascinating, because you're looking at, the rock art, especially petroglyphs, arguably, they can last longer than, say, a midden or a site archaeologically that can be eroded away. And out here, you're looking at thousands upon thousands of years, and you're wondering what these people put there and why they do it, and why is one style so distinctive from another? What's the meaning behind them? And it's fascinating to muse on it. And again, I get the public all the time coming out here going, hey, where are all the rock art sites? I want to see some petroglyphs. And there are a couple sites that we guide them to, but the majority of them we do not. Yeah, it's just interesting. You're looking at, and you can put your hand up next to something that somebody 10,000 years ago had their hand next to. And who knows what they were thinking or doing when they were ascribing that image to the rock face.
Which sites do you typically lead the public to that are protected and perhaps available for public interpretation?
We have what's called the hole in the wall rings loop trail, where we actually have interpretive signage and we interpret the site, which people can visit. If people do a minimal amount of research on the internet, they can find all kinds of other sites in the preserve itself that they can visit. There's a fellow out of Baker whose name was Bill Mann, and he's published locations of sites out here. And then there's a lot of people that have institutional knowledge that they've been sharing with others, and word gets out. But, there's hundreds upon hundreds of sites out here, rock art sites. So, you got to figure 3% of them, if that, are known. So largely the sites are in a passive preservation state in that people don't know where they are, so they can't be affected.
Great. So given this tremendous inventory of rock art sites, both petroglyphs and pictographs, how do you manage them? How do you protect them?
Well, what we try to do is document them. We want to document them and inventory them so that we can have a baseline by which we can monitor them. For the most part, there's nothing we can do except educate the public, and that works. We have examples, you've seen them out here, of hunters and others using petroglyphs for target practice. Not so much now, but back in the day when, this was Bureau of Land Management lands out here in kind of the Wild West, people had a lot less respect for, because they had a lot less knowledge of and about the resources per se. So the baseline documentation and inventory is primarily what we're trying to do, and then protecting locational information from just anybody. We don't lead huge tours or anything like that. And when we do run into people that have knowledge of the locations of these, we just sort of tell them, hey, it's not illegal to share that knowledge, but these are the issues that we have, and this is why we would prefer you not to publish or openly share this resource knowledge with others.
Are you seeing a growing veneration or sort of respect for the rock art, or is that something we're still working on?
No, that's absolutely right. I've seen the damage of the resources, the rock art resources, and archaeological sites in general out here. Remarkably, in the 19 years that I've been out here, it's really, people have grown to respect. And one of the things I do is I talk to local groups in Las Vegas, in Needles, some of the smaller communities surrounding me, and I give presentations on these things, and I share the knowledge that professionally you and I are into reading in the gray literature and whatnot, and then they feel like they're included in the protection of the resources. Yeah.
So you're going to surprise us in the third segment with some sort of a amazing case study?
On specifically rock art?
Well, whatever.
Sure.
Give us a teaser before what do you got for us?
Well, I'd like to talk about the study we're doing around one of our dry lakes. Is pretty interesting.
Wow. Okay. Well, we look forward for that in the next segment. See y'all in the flip-flop.
At Grand Canyon University, we believe in equal opportunity, and the American dream starts with purpose. Whether your pursuit involves a bachelor's, master's, or doctoral degree, GCU's learning environments are designed for supportive networking and collaboration. With over 330 academic programs, GCU provides a path to help you fulfill your dreams. The pursuit to serve others is yours. Find your purpose at GCU. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
Hey, all you folks out in archaeology podcast land. This is your Rock Art podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel of the California Rock Art Foundation. And we're blessed and honored to have David Nichols, who's the park archaeologist for the National Mojave Preserve in the eastern Mojave Desert of California. Are you there, David?
I am.
And you had surprised us at the end of that last segment with a little treasure. You said you're going to unveil a very, very interesting and engaging project that you think it has some legs and perhaps would be of great interest to our listeners. Please go right ahead.
So we got, oh God, it must be 12 years ago now, an interesting proposal by young associate professor Dr. Edward Nell at Cal State Fullerton to do a survey and an inventory of some rock quarry sites in the Soda Mountains, which is the very westernmost bound of our park here. The Soda Mountains also happen to be the western boundary of Soda Dry Lake, which is one of these huge Pleistocene dry lakes, and it's the terminus of the internally draining, mostly subterranean Mojave River, rather a famous river for those of us that work in this area. As it turns out, this had a very unique seam of kind of a blue, black, gray andesite that they were just quarrying the heck out of and making these huge palm-sized bifaces out of on site. And these quarries were all on this. And you do not find this particular type of material anywhere else in the preserve, only around this lake and in these quarry sites. So I have no idea. We had no idea where this material is going. And that part of the study is ongoing. They were definitely working it around the perimeter of Soda Dry Lake. And they're of a type that's called Mojave point type. And it's like a Pleistocene type of point, Lake Mojave complex. We're guessing that the material is moving westward because it's definitely not moving eastward. But after we saw that, we started expanding the survey to include the entirety of what would have been the lakeshore of Soda Dry Lake. And we started doing transects parallel to what would have been the shoreline. And we were finding bands of sites that would have been along Pleistocene lake shores. Fascinating part of it is we found 3 of those bands. And those bands are showing morphological and technological differences in point typologies and other types of artifacts that are describing temporally different shorelines. I rarely have seen water in this lake basin, but this study is speaking to a sedentary culture type that is exploiting lake-type resources, including shellfish, probably migratory birds. We haven't done any excavations around these shorelines, but this study's been going on for quite some time, and it's ongoing. And the data just gets more and more interesting. And Dr. Nell's been really great at publishing and giving papers on describing what he thinks has been going on there. What's interesting is very few people that work in this area have attempted to do this type of Paleo-Indian, arguably, type study. He came from the Midwest, and so he was really only looking for that really, really early stuff. So I was very skeptical when he came down here and proposed this study. But the further he pursues it, the more interesting it becomes, because I don't find that type of early culture in most of the rest of the park. And we only have 2 of these sort of old Pleistocene lake beds, and nothing's been done at the other one. He's been concentrating all of his work at this Soda Lake complex, and it's just been fascinating.
So these western stem points that he's talking about, these are Lake Mojave and Silver Lake points, or also they believe that some of those may have been actual tools or implements rather than even projectile points or dart points. But according to Claude Warren, who's worked at the Lake Mojave site itself for much of his adult career, that whole period dates between, I think, 7,000 and 12,000 years ago.
Yeah, it's in that margin. And Dr. Warren was the one that first identified that Lake Mojave complex. So not that much is known about it. And the work that Claude did was very limited. So this is really on the tails of his pioneering work, far and away the most type of work that's been done for that early stuff in that area. But yeah, you're right.
I've never heard of anyone really doing a rigorous study of quarry or biface blanks or some sort of, reduction process that I know that Nell is famous for in terms of retrofitting or examining the actual lithic technology reduction and all of that involved, which would be absolutely fascinating. And there is a controversy surrounding how ancient those western stem points are. Some people believe that they are, in fact, coterminous or coincidental, synchronous with the western fluted style and go back to the almost the earliest Paleo-Indian remains in all of California. You're probably aware of that, aren't you?
Yeah. And I think particularly the Mojave or Silver Lake point is considered a little bit even earlier than what they call the Great Basin stemmed. I think it's typologically a little bit it's unique from that and considered possibly a precursor or something a little bit earlier than the stem point.
Interesting. And
we do occasionally find fluting on some of these things as well.
Fascinating. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So there seems to be a derivative element of the technology that's carried forward from that western fluted ancient stratum.
Right.
And of course, that's a subject that I've been working on and off for many years. But there's the issue surrounding, certainly in California, which is an ongoing discussion, and I'd say a very topical controversy as to how old is there, first of all, a Western Clovis expression in California? And if it is, how old is it? What does it endure to? And how does that technological structure relate back to perhaps some of the more classic material on the plains or in the American Southwest? And then, of course, what were they eating? Were they really doing anything with some of that megafauna that we hear about? Because there has never been any, incontrovertible associations of megafaunal remains and human use anywhere in California.
Right.
As I understand it.
Yeah. And I throw the Clovis first arguments or Clovis in California theorists in the same bag with you rock art nuts. I will not participate.
You're going to sidestep the controversy so that you'll let us dabble and try to deal with the data such as it is and see what we can do to resolve some of these thorny problems of typology, chronology. But you were saying that there seems to be some association with distinctive or chronological, typological expressions that are associated with certain episodes of the lake.
Yes. Yeah, it's fascinating. We have 3 distinct lakeshore bands, and he's done all kinds of modeling and looking at environmental conditions to, the early Holocene, late Pleistocene era to see how those would reflect what the water stands would have looked like. And now he's got some grad students working on what would have been areas of shoreline growth where there could have been other seed resources or those types of things going on across that shoreline. So the quarries are on the western shore of the lake, and the stands where they're moving the material to, where you actually have playa expressions, are on the east side. So all you see on the west side of the lake is crazy quarrying and making these big bifaces and moving material, but you don't see secondary, tertiary, or finishing product production until you go to the east side of the lake. So they're procuring material on the west side, and then they're walking all the way around that thing past Baker, California, to the playa stands on the east side. Yeah, it's really interesting. And like he just sent me even more data today, which was even more interesting.
Is this Soda Lake and Nell's work in the preserve still part of that same expression that we call Lake Mojave?
It is. Lake Mojave is made up of Soda Lake and Silver Lake combined. So those two,
That's what I
even
was
those,
thinking, yeah.
yeah, we consider Silver Lake the overflow of Soda Lake. The two combined altogether is considered Lake Mojave.
So all the work that Claude's done and the work that Nell's doing might interfinger at some point, and we might have some sort of a take about what was going on chronologically, typologically, and even technologically for that in that fact. And then we just have to figure out what they're eating and what they're doing, right?
Yeah, and Nels is going to be the greatest and latest because, of course, he's incorporating and speaking to the work that Claude had done. And Claude Warren actually came out with us in the field and showed us where he had excavated and the sorts of things that he found and theoretically what he was thinking about. So nobody would have to go back to the original source material. It will be expressed in Nell's work. And nobody else is doing this kind of work out here, that's for sure.
No, I'm sure not. Well, I know that just as a sidebar, during the excavations that Claude had done, he found an obsidian flake buried in one of their units, and it was sourced to the Coso obsidian source. And
yeah,
the
we have that.
Hydration rim, the measurement was quite substantial. Certainly not quite equivalent to the oldest of the Paleo-Indian remains, but damn near. So
yeah,
fascinating stuff. What other things about other projects do you think have some, rock art sizzle to them? I know ours did. What about the work there at the other site vis-a-vis the archaeoastronomical elements out there at Council Rocks?
Yeah, that's interesting. And you found a lot more that was credible to theorizing that some archaeoastronomical elements exist at the Council Rocks site and the Mary's Cave site also. And Dr. David Whitley has spoke to a little bit of that. Again, I read about it and I study on it. I don't personally have much in the way of theories about it, but it's interesting. It's interesting to me. Those sorts of things are hard to prove when you don't have a lot of ethnographic information about them, and we really kind of don't. We have, in my opinion, sort of Eurocentric views of, what midnight is or when the sun strikes a certain crack in a certain rock and things like that. But it's still interesting to me. It's just, it's hard to sort of source and locate and identify that in if you talk to the tribes today about these particular sites, or try to identify it in some of the ethnohistoric or ethnographic literature of, the turn of the last century.
Yeah, because much of their knowledge is now somewhat incomplete because of this demarcation with the Euro-American intrusion and all of the catastrophes that face them in terms of trying to keep their culture alive and dealing with just the decimation and the population reduction and the loss of their cultural lifeways. So we're trying to piece it together.
Dude, absolutely that. And, without being disrespectful, I mean, factually, in the rebuilding of some of their cultural characteristics and trying to rebuild the stories of their people and origin stories and things like that, necessarily they're bringing in elements of modern day Christian mysticism and other things that have influenced them culturally in the last 150 years that they identify with and are incorporated into what they now construe as the history of their cultures and their origins and their beginnings.
Sure. And with any culture, of course, we're seeing the dynamics of cultures may appear to be stagnant, but they're vital and alive things and
yes.
Wax and wane and change and transform. So I find that to be one of the more interesting elements of trying to understand some of the transformations and modifications of indigenous culture in rock art. And as a sidebar, some of the stuff that I've done on the ghost dance rock art.
Interesting.
Yeah. So anyways, I guess that's a good place to leave it with another mystery.
Yeah.
David, it's been a pleasure. The hour went way too fast, and we'd love to have you back again sometime. But I really appreciate you taking the time out of your rather busy schedule to talk with us and share your passion for the Eastern Mojave Desert, the National Mojave Preserve, rock art, and archaeology anthropology. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Cool. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. See you next week, gang.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. You can find this podcast on the educational podcast app Lyceum, Lyceum, and wherever you find podcasts. Find show notes and contact information at www.arcpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.